Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, travel company led by reporters around the world. And my name's Owen Bennett-Jones, as I'm standing in for Nicholas Wood today, who's in Moldova. And we're discussing India, where the elections have just happened. Many predicted another big win for Modi, but in the end, he got fewer seats than I think most people expected, and he's had to form a coalition. So what does that say about his power, about the next 5 years, about the state of Hindu nationalism? Will it change anything in India? And to discuss all that, I'm joined by a very long-standing observer of the country, former BBC correspondent and editor, Andrew Whitehead. And why don't you just begin with your background, Andrew? You reported from India.
Yes, I was a BBC correspondent there actually in the 1990s when what is now the governing party, the BJP, was first making serious progress in national politics. And I went back there and spent another 2 or 3 years there in the early 2000s. And I now teach there every year. So I was in Chennai, Madrasas was in South India in February and March, teaching a postgraduate course in journalism there. And I also had the chance to go to North India as well, to Lucknow and Delhi and Rajasthan. So I have, my wife is Indian, our children were born in India, so I've got quite close personal links to the country, as well as being, as Owen says, a seasoned, or in Indian parlance, a veteran observer of the scene.
Yep. And did you expect this result?
No. Absolutely not. I was watching very closely. I was watching the campaign. There were some signs that the BJP campaign wasn't going very well. Narendra Modi personally was much more, to be blunt about it, vulgar in his campaign rhetoric than he had been in the past. Normally he leaves it to his underlings, so to speak, to do the sort of political dirty work in propaganda terms. This time, it was him, and that gave a lot of people the impression that the campaign was faltering in some way, but we didn't expect the sort of setback that he suffered. And you've got to put that in context. Narendra Modi remains India's prime minister. He has won a third term. He is only the second Indian leader ever to win 3 successive terms in power. But for 20 years, his path has been gradually upwards, first in his home state of Gujarat, then in national politics. And he and his party clearly believed they were going to make further gains in this election. And instead, they lost their single party overall majority, though their alliance still has an overall majority. And for the first time, he's been forced into a coalition government, and he's had to give cabinet seats, 5 of them, to allied parties, which are not ideological allies, they're allies of convenience.
Yeah, and I just wonder what that will do to his thinking, because I think many people would say that he's become quite hubristic, probably was even when he got into power, and certainly after so many years in power, that does tend to happen. And he's had this reverse, which it sounds like you're saying in the campaign he sort of thought was coming, because he was being more aggressive than normal. So what impact will it have on him, do you think?
We don't know, because this is uncharted territory, but he did say during the campaign, I just jotted it down, he said in Hindi, God has sent me for a purpose. And, you couldn't get much more hubristic than that. And I think one of the things that went against him is there was a sense that he had overreached himself, that the cult of personality was becoming too overpowering. And certainly some of the post-election opinion polls have suggested that Modi himself is significantly less popular and less well regarded as leader than he was 2 or 3 years ago. He could, of course, batten down. His party remains by far the most important national party. Congress, its main rival, has less than half the number of seats in Parliament. But he will now be constrained by the need to keep a coalition together. So he can't play the Hindu nationalist, some would say the Hindu chauvinist card quite so relentlessly, because some of his allies will not want to be marked in that way.
Let me just remind everyone that they can participate in this, and it's great if you ask questions and help, get Andrew onto the topics that you really want. So you can either raise your digital hand, or you can put something in Q&A, and I will endeavour to get you online so that you can put your question directly to Andrew. So tell us about the coalition, how that's going to work. He's had to share ministerial offices outside the BJP for the first time, right? So which ones, do we know yet which ones have gone to who?
Yes, we do. I mean, there've been plenty of coalition governments in India in the past, including coalition governments led by the BJP, but never under Modi. There's a cabinet of 30, and he's given 5 cabinet minister positions to allied parties, not the important ones. So he's reappointed all his inner team. There's been no change in finance minister, in foreign minister, in home minister, or defense minister. So the allies have got minor briefs, you'd have to say, such as, for example, civil aviation. It's not unimportant, or food. These are significant, but they're not the key ministries of government. And to be honest, I think his allies are entirely happy with that, because the allied parties are regional parties. So the leaders of those parties are chief ministers in their home states. They don't want cabinet berths. They've given those cabinet jobs to more junior members of those allied parties. They want a stake in government, but they don't necessarily expect to get the big jobs. So, I mean, but I don't think Narendra Modi can simply continue, though, as business as usual. His victory speech gave no acknowledgement at all to any sort of sense of setback or any loss of hemorrhaging of public support. It didn't mention that actually the BJP had lost in Uttar Pradesh, which is India's biggest, 220 million people, biggest and most politically powerful state. And that was the biggest surprise. I've got people from India staying with me at the moment. One of them is from UP. She just could not believe that the BJP had lost in her home state. It is absolutely their political heartland, and that is by far the most serious reverse. India is such a big country, there aren't uniform political swings, but losing UP is just, politically unimaginable.
Okay, I'll ask you about UP and about Congress later, but just now, these coalition partners he's got, because they're regional parties, does that mean that you can't really say they're to the right of him or to the left of him? It's more they just got a different agenda, is it?
Yeah, I mean, they move around. So the 2 main parties, I mean, it's the Telugu Desam, which is the governing party in one of the southern states, and the Janata Dal United, it's not all that united, which is the governing party in Bihar, one of the biggest Hindi belt states. But their agendas are local and regional. They have I'm sure that if they had a chance to be prime minister, their leaders would go for it, but they don't expect to get the top job in Delhi. And what they are particularly looking out for is basically favors for their states. They want special status for their states, which means they would get more federal money. But the other big thing, which I think this means, is Modi instinctively is a centralizer. He wants power in his own hands. And there's been a drift of power from the states to the centre over the 10 years he's been in office. And that's been resented by the states. India's constitution is federal, and the states and the state leaders have a great deal of power. I don't think there can be any more centralizing, because those state-based, regional-based parties, which are now part of the cabinet, simply won't stand for it.
UP, tell us why it was so pro-BJP. Why was it the heartland? What was the demographics, the history, the politics, the societal developments? What was it there that made it the BJP heartland, and why has it ebbed away?
Well, politics in Uttar Pradesh are very complex, and it was once the Congress Party heartland. It is by far the most politically powerful state. It is the heart of the Hindi belt. And more than half of India's Hindi speakers live in Uttar Pradesh. And it's also the state where Ayodhya is. Ayodhya is the birthplace of the Hindu deity Lord Ram. And the BJP's path to national power was by demanding, campaigning that a magnificent Hindu temple, those are the words in their repeated manifestos, should be built at Lord Ram's birthplace, which might be entirely unobjectionable, but for the fact there was a Muslim place of worship standing on the alleged site of the birthplace. And the BJP supported a movement, an illegal movement, to pull down the mosque in 1992, something which tore India apart and led to extremely bloody rioting with thousands of lives lost in many cities across India, but then has a campaign for the building of a Ram temple in Ayodhya, which the Prime Minister inaugurated a few months ago. India is a secular nation, but at the inauguration, the key figure was not a clerical figure, but India's head of government. And there was a belief that that would consolidate the BJP's position in Uttar Pradesh, and they have as their state chief minister actually a Hindu cleric who wears saffron robes. But for reasons we don't fully understand, though I think we can guess what some of them are, they have lost ground enormously. So in national terms, the BJP only lost 1% of the vote from the previous election. But in Uttar Pradesh, they were down by 8%, and they lost almost half their UP seats in the national parliament.
So looked at from abroad, I mean, I think many people have seen, Modi as slightly illiberal, as quite nationalist, as intolerant of other faiths and so on. Are those the reasons that move people in UP, or is that's just a liberal Western perspective and it's just looked at very differently in India?
It's not really the reasons why they've lost ground in UP. I think to some extent the UP have shot their own fox. You're campaigning for a couple of decades on building a temple in Ayodhya. You've built the temple, you've opened it, so that's mission accomplished. So that is no longer the same motivating force. But I think the big thing is that even though India has a much higher level of economic growth than any other major economy, it hasn't provided the jobs. So inequality in India is becoming much more pronounced. The Indian middle class are doing very well indeed. The Indian poor are doing, by and large, not so well. There are lots of welfare schemes which help them, but there's a profound shortage of jobs, particularly for young graduates. And time and again, the BJP has said, vote for us, we'll give you jobs, we'll look after you. And actually, they haven't delivered in the way that their supporters and their voters thought they would. And I think they've been punished at the polls.
I'm surprised you say that, because, I mean, they have had, under Modi, significant economic growth, haven't they? I mean, they keep getting very good numbers.
Huge economic growth, 6%, 7%, 8%, much better than in the West, and now even outperforming China. And there's really impressive infrastructure projects. I drove on an 8-lane highway in Rajasthan just a couple of months ago. This is not what you expect in one of the poorer Indian states, but nevertheless, the trickle down, to use that rather discredited idea, simply hasn't happened in full measure. So welfare schemes, yes. Jobs, and particularly government jobs, which are the jobs that many college graduates most want, no. Not in the measure that the BJP has promised. And I think that sense of resentment that the BJP has overpromised is part of the problem. And there's something else as well. So caste is enormously important in India. And the BJP talked about if they got a big majority, they might make changes to the constitution. Well, one of the things about the constitution is it has schedules which list those groups which basically benefit from affirmative action programs and have benefited for decades from those programs. So the idea that the BJP might change the constitution was used by the opposition parties to say, you vote for the BJP, you can't be sure that the affirmative action which benefits your community will remain in place. So beware. And I think that had quite an impact on how people voted.
Talk us through Congress. It's had a very bad period for how long now? And is it any sign of ending?
Well, Congress has doubled its seats in Parliament from a very low base, and it's now at 99 out of 520 odd. So for a party which for the first 30 years of India's independence was the only governing party, it's nowhere back to where it once was, but it feels like it's on the way up again. The problem with Congress, I mean, in essence, it's a social democratic party. It puts a lot of emphasis on the marginalized, on religious minorities, particularly India's very large Muslim community, and on welfare programs and increased public spending and service provision. But it's a family firm. So it's at the moment, I mean, he's not formally the leader, but actually the leader of the party is Rahul Gandhi, whose father was prime minister, whose grandmother was prime minister, and whose great grandfather was prime minister. So we've had, 3 generations of prime minister, and then there's him. And actually, he hasn't been a great campaigner. He's not shown a great hunger for politics. He's not instinctively a politician. And he's led the party to some really terrible election results. Any other party, he would have been given his cards and told to, find another job, to be blunt about it. But Congress, being dynastic, always found excuses for him and said he's still doing a good job. This time round, he has done a better job. Actually, he learned some lessons from the BJP. He had a yatra. A yatra sort of means a pilgrimage, but basically he walked on foot through much of India. I mean, a huge journey as a sort of show of a campaign both against the BJP, but to preserve what he saw as the idea of India, which is secular, tolerant, and particularly supportive of minorities and their place in Indian society and public life. And that went very well. And he clearly seemed to enjoy meeting people. And I think that led to a dividend. And also, this time round, Congress has been much cleverer in how it puts together an alliance. In the past, Congress's idea of an alliance has been to say to other parties, follow us. And actually, they don't want to follow a party which hasn't been electorally very successful. Why should they? This time round, it was much more of an alliance of equals. And in Uttar Pradesh, where the BJP was surprisingly relegated to second place, it wasn't Congress that outflanked them. It was a local party, the Samajwadi Party. Samajwadi would sort of translate as socialist, but they're not terribly ideological. But it was them that outflanked the BJP, and Congress had the good sense to let the Samajwadi Party stand as the alliance candidate in seats that they could win, rather than saying, no, we want the seats that we've got the best chance of winning.
Sort of tactical voting and tactical manoeuvring. So it seems to me that, as you know, I'm much more familiar with Pakistan, and it seems to me that there is a parallel between Imran Khan and Modi, who both helped break down this dynastic system and, were Islamist and Hindu nationalist, according to where they came from. But the dynastic thing in Pakistan looks like it's over. It's very difficult to see the Bhuttos making their way back to power.
Well, you've got the Sharifs in power now.
Yeah, we've got the Sharifs there. That's right. But the parallel has always been with the Gandhis and the Bhuttos, and it looks like it's over for the Bhuttos. Not over for the Gandhis.
No, I mean, I think Rahul Gandhi has a new lease of political life. He's still in his early 50s, so he's not old, and certainly not by Indian political standards. Modi is in his early 70s. Though I do wonder if in the next election the BJP is defeated. My suspicion is, and this is perhaps a rash thing to say, but I wonder whether the opposition prime minister will come from one of the regional parties rather than from Congress. But in terms of Modi and Imran Khan, I can see what you're saying, but in terms of their personal backstories, hugely different. Narendra Modi, very modest lifestyle, sort of very unostentatious, no personal flamboyance at all, incorruptible, the opposite of a playboy. He had a wife, but his sort of his people who speak on his behalf suggested that marriage was never consummated, and it was an arranged marriage when he was a teenager, and he went off after a year or two of his marriage to become a pracharak, which basically means an evangelist for the RSS, the most powerful organization in India outside the political parties, which is the organization to which the BJP is umbilically linked. But he was a religious evangelist. I don't think anybody would say that Imran Khan was a religious evangelist. You know much more about him than I do, but I don't get that impression.
No, well, he's become one later in life, and is genuinely Islamist now, I think, and very, very disdainful of the West, which I guess is something that they have in common. Is Modi anti-West?
No, and he in his first term in office, he put a huge amount of effort into winning over Western leaders, and it worked very well with Obama, with David Cameron here in the UK. They both hosted him. They both praised him. And India's an important country, and the West needs it as a bulwark against China. But nevertheless, it was something more than that. There was a personal equation there. But on the other hand, Hindu nationalism's mindset is we Hindus, we are the majority in India, and for centuries we've been ruled by outsiders, Muslims, Mughals, then it was the British, and it's time now for Hindus to stand up and assert ourselves. So there is that sort of tension there. He doesn't look fondly on the period of British rule in India, and to be honest, there's no reason why he should.
Tell us more about the, and just let me once again encourage people to either raise their hand or put a question into the Q&A box. Just tell us a bit more about, you say, Cameron, Obama were impressed. Where is diaspora politics now? So, Modi was going around filling stadiums in America and in the UK, wasn't he?
Yeah, just about everywhere. I mean, he in the Middle East, in parts of the Far East, Singapore, even France, which you wouldn't necessarily expect. Modi is absolutely loved by the diaspora. Not everybody in the diaspora, of course, but he is seen as somebody who is a strong man, a strong leader, who makes India bigger on the world stage because he doesn't kowtow to the West. There's also another factor. Modi is a Gujarati. He's from the western state of Gujarat. And Gujaratis are disproportionately represented in the Indian diaspora. Certainly here in the UK, I think Gujaratis account for, I think, about half or approaching half of the people here of Indian origin. And the people of Indian origin are the biggest ethnic minority in Britain. And Gujaratis just are very proud of having a Gujarati leading the country. And a lot of Gujaratis are business people, entrepreneurs, shopkeepers. And the BJP in India appeals very much to, its roots are in shopkeepers and small business people. So I think, that fits very well. So I don't think the diaspora are shouting for him quite as loudly as they once did, but I don't think he's lost their support. And I think the diaspora provides quite a lot of money to his campaigns. They're important to him, and they give him a profile which is noticed. I mean, I was at Wembley, the biggest stadium in London, where Modi gave an address entirely in Gujarati and Hindi. Happily, there was simultaneous translation, and he was introduced by David Cameron. And the audience was almost entirely Indian diaspora. And I was talking to other journalists there. If David Cameron had been the sole speaker, you wouldn't have had 60,000. You wouldn't have had 6,000. You might have had 1,000. But Modi, even when he's not talking, within his own country, can draw crowds which political leaders, certainly in Britain, could never dream of. And I think that was noticed. Actually, there's something about what Modi was doing, his style of politics, which really did resonate. Of course, he's a populist. Not a crude populist, but he is a populist, and he's very good at finding ways of. He tweeted a great deal. He still has a regular sort of fireside chat on the radio to not terribly political. It really is quite a chat to radio listeners in India. Things that actually you don't get in Western democracies.
You're a very learned fellow. Have you ever been to Wembley for a football match?
Yes, I have. My team, Huddersfield Town, I'll just get a mention in. They've even won a couple of matches at Wembley quite a while ago, but yes, I've been there.
Might have been your first time. Hilary Matthews' microphone is not working, so I'm going to ask her a question, which is actually one that I was coming to anyway, which is, where does he stand on Russia? Where does he stand on the Russia-China thing? The Indian-Chinese hostility has been there for years. How does that work now? So the geopolitical picture.
India's traditional rival is regarded as Pakistan. India and Pakistan are both nuclear powers. Actually, India's not too worried about Pakistan because it thinks it's got the measure of Pakistan. It can see them off. China it lost a war to. I mean, way back in the 1960s, but nevertheless, it's the only war that independent India has lost. And it's deeply worried about China and nervous of China. And in some places, the borders have not been fully demarcated. And there was a very nasty clash in northwest India on a disputed border a few years ago, in which the Chinese killed 20 Indian soldiers without using firearms. And it was an awful, awful incident. And that really disturbed people across India, but particularly the government. So India has cordial relations with China. It has a big trading partnership with China, and unusually for India, a trade deficit with China. But India also positions itself as the democratic nation in Asia, which the West should support as a bulwark against Chinese expansionism. In terms of Russia, traditionally, Russia and India have had strong relations. Still quite a lot of Russia's military hardware, India's military hardware is from Russia. And it was very conspicuous that when the war in Ukraine erupted, India did not succumb to pressure, particularly from Washington, to boycott Russia. And it still buys, at a discount actually, quite a lot of Russian oil. When I say quite a lot, I mean a lot of Russian oil. India is a major oil importer. And I have to say the political mood in India is not on Ukraine's side. This is not just the government being slightly independent and maneuvering a position between Washington and Moscow and Beijing. Public opinion basically can't quite understand why the West is so actively supporting Ukraine.
Yes, well, I saw some very interesting stuff on the Russian information campaign around the Ukraine conflict or Ukraine war, and it showed a massive effort in India, social media and all the rest of it, from the Russians trying to win over Indian opinion. And you're saying that's worked?
Yeah, I mean, I think people see they think the view would be, and this is a view from people broadly across the political spectrum, that actually the West is sort of supporting Ukraine simply to do down Moscow, and Ukraine is a pawn in a struggle between the West and Moscow. And actually, India is traditionally more sympathetic to Moscow. It was non-aligned during the Cold War, but its links were probably close. Well, they were closer to Moscow than to Washington.
Now, Lois, you've got your hand up. I think if you unmute yourself, we could hear your question or comment.
Yes, I mean, my question is really about we've had an electoral result which was certainly not shown in any of the pre-polling, and this kind of result seems to be on the rise. In other words, the ability to predict the electorate does seem to be an issue that is rising. Do you think there are lessons of what's happened in India with what's happening with the next lots of elections around the world?
Which means UK, West and elsewhere.
It's a really interesting question, Lewis, and I've been thinking about that because, of course, in Britain, we're in the middle of an election campaign. Voting is early next month. There was one opinion pollster that got it right, a very well-regarded one, a guy called Yogendra Yadav. So it wasn't that all of them got it wrong. The strange thing is the exit polls in India got it wrong. So voting ended on June the 1st, and that's when the exit polls were released, and the votes weren't counted until June the 4th. The exit polls, all the exit polls pointed to a commanding BJP victory, and all the exit polls were wrong. So why is that? I think one of the problems in India, which you don't get in anything like the same way in the UK or the US, is how do you stage exit polls in such an enormous nation of 1.4 billion, and how do you correct, given that the demographic profile of those that you do reach will not represent all the voters, how do you correct? And I think what happens is the exit pollsters, they shouldn't do this, and I'm speaking not from a position of inside information, but I suspect this is what's happened. They looked, so how we've got this raw data, how do we balance this to reflect all the people that we believe have cast their votes in caste terms, regional terms, gender, all the others. And then they think, and what are we expecting the result to be? And that's partly in their mind when they're doing these equations. Plus, I have to say, almost all the news organizations which were commissioning opinion polls and exit polls are sort of not very critical, shall we say, of Narendra Modi. And I think to some extent, possibly, pollsters may have been providing the sort of findings which the people commissioning the polls would have been keen to publicize. That's a supposition, simply a supposition, but I do wonder whether there may be something in that.
I'll just add something to this because it's something I've looked at quite closely over the years, actually, and this is a business of adjusting them to predict the result. I'm afraid is truer than we would like to think, and that pollsters do it, and they do have leeway in the way they can put together the representative sample, and that does lead them to problems when they are basically trying to make results. Their results fit with the general perceptions. And I think there's another thing going on, which must be particularly prevalent in India, certainly true in the UK, that when regional voting breaks down, so there's much more regional voting than national voting. It's not one representative sample across the 60 million Brits anymore. Everything, lots of different things happening in different parts of the country makes the polling much more difficult. And that must be true for India.
It is, absolutely. And also there's no uniform swing, but also India has a first past the post system. So it's very difficult to read from percentage support for any party to the number of seats won. As I say, the BJP, I got the figures, the BJP's share of the vote this time around was only down by a little bit less than 1% from 5 years ago, but they lost more than 60 of their 300 seats in Parliament. So they lost, more than 20% of their seats in Parliament with a 1% share in national vote decline. That's partly because of the way in which the opposition organised itself and the effectiveness of their alliance. But it just demonstrates it's very difficult to move from a percentage share of the vote to the strength in Parliament.
But just on the exit poll, does that? I mean, it is inexplicable that exit polls are wrong, really, isn't it? Because I mean, they're normally so accurate for obvious reasons.
Well, not in India. I mean, they were. I think they were 5 years ago, but they have a fair. When I say a checkered record, I mean a fairly dreadful record. And to be honest, the purpose of exit polls, in terms of those commissioning them, is to provide a talking point in the 3 days between the final day of voting and the counting of votes. What do they do in those 3 days? All these news channels and digital platforms, they've got to have something to talk about, and the exit polls helps to provide that, fill that gap.
And just one last question on the electoral process. I know that they computerized it and there were question marks over the security of that and whether results were being manipulated by just sort of tweaking a bit of software. Have you any hints that the system is compromised in India?
I'm pausing. A former chief election commissioner, Dr. S.Y. Qureshi, who I know personally and absolutely believe is unimpeachable, is clear that the electronic voting machines cannot be tampered with, and that they are absolutely reliable. Before the election, there was a great deal of concern. There were suggestions that the governing party or allies of the governing party had found ways of tampering either with the voting process or the collation of results from voting machines. But I have to say, since the results came out, there hasn't been a chorus of complaint about election irregularities, the electronic voting machines not working properly, or anything like that. There have been complaints about impropriety during the campaign, but not impropriety in the voting and counting process.
I've had another question from Hillary, which sort of more clearly expresses something I rather clumsily tried to ask earlier, so I'll ask it in her clear way, which is, did Modi, this is reading from her text, did Modi overreach himself by playing such a prominent role in the opening of Ayodhya before it was completed? Did that upset Hindu priests and conservative Hindus? I mean, is that a problem?
Did he overreach himself? I'd say perhaps. I mean, I think it was a factor that he was too hubristic. I don't think, by and large, it disturbed Hindu clerics and the Hindu conservatives, partly because actually there's nowhere else for them to go. If you're supporting a party which embraces Hindutva, the idea that India is in essence a Hindu nation, then the BJP is the party that you would support. I do think a lot of eyebrows were raised when it became apparent that Narendra Modi was the main guy at the inauguration. He is the leader of a nation with a head of government of a nation with a secular constitution. I mean, India is a secular nation according to its constitution, and there were all sorts of constitutional proprieties which were probably honoured in the breach. But I think the bigger problem is if you've campaigned for decades, as I said earlier, if you've campaigned for decades to achieve something, then you get it and you can say job done. How then do you galvanize your base? And I think that's the problem that the BJP had in the Hindi-speaking belt in the north, which is where it's most powerful.
I've got a question from Marty. If you could unmute yourself, Marty, could you ask a question now?
Yes. What are Modi's agendas, both internally and internationally? And on the international front, what level of influence does he want to have on that international stage?
That actually touches on something I've always wondered about him, because most leaders become more interested in foreign politics, don't they? Because they think it's sort of more important as they stay in office, and it probably fits in with their ideas of themselves on the global stage. But Modi maybe has been more India-minded than more internally minded than most leaders, or not.
Well, I think to start with, when he came to power, 10 years ago, he had a very bad press in the West. He had for many years been banned from traveling to the United States because of suggestions that he was at least culpable when chief minister of Gujarat in an anti-Muslim pogrom. And he felt he needed to basically show, I've won, you've got to deal with me. But he also wanted to go on a little bit of a charm offensive, which he did in Washington and London and elsewhere. And I think having established himself on the world stage, he decided to focus back on what was, economic growth and various other key things that he wanted to achieve in India. In terms of where he wants India to be internationally, I think he basically wants to be confident that India is not losing out to China, either in terms of borders or in terms of perceived pecking order within Asia. I think he wants to maintain good relations with both Washington and, as best he can, Moscow. I mean, I think if the chips were down, he might well go for Washington over Moscow, but if he can keep both in play, he will do. Domestically, I think he would, if he'd had a landslide majority, I think he would probably change the constitution to take out the reference to India being a secular nation. He doesn't believe that India should be a secular nation. One of the things that I think he would like to do, and I think he may not now be able to do, was to introduce a uniform civil code. So at the moment, religious groups in India, their personal law, inheritance, marriage, divorce, adoption, things like that they have their own separate religious codes, and particularly the Muslim community, inheritance, marriage, quite a lot of issues to do with the status of women are defined by religious law rather than by civil law. And Modi has always believed there should be a uniform civil code, which means abolishing the special privileges for Muslim personal and family law. In some ways, it's an argument that some progressives think is right. Actually, there should be a uniform law for everybody, irrespective of your religious identity. Indian Muslims, of course, would be deeply resentful of the loss of this privilege. I don't think it's going to be very easy for him to do that because his allied parties rely to some extent on Muslim support. By the way, just something I just wanted to mention. So the BJP and their allies now have, I've got the total here, 293 seats in the Indian parliament. If Muslims were represented proportionately in the governing alliance, then 1 in 7, so about 40 of those MPs would be Muslim. How many Muslim members of parliament are there for India's governing alliance? None at all. Not one. Zero. Which is really striking. And indeed, earlier iterations of the BJP did find ways of having a very small number of Muslims among their ranks in parliament and in public life. I mean, but actually, Modi has given up on that facade. You know, we're a Hindu party. There are some Christians who have had prominent rank within the BJP, but at the moment, there are no Muslims, Christians, or Sikhs within the BJP's parliamentary party in India. It is basically a Hindu-only parliamentary party, which for a country which is so diverse is really quite remarkable.
We have a few minutes left, so if people want to ask a question, there's still a chance to do that. As I just wait for people to either write in the Q&A box or to raise their digital hand. Let me just ask you about nuclear stuff, because I always remember going to Kashmir once and meeting on the Indian side, I think it was a former chief minister or something like that, who said, you know, we are in a very difficult position here, surrounded by China, Pakistan, and India, all nuclear powers, and we don't even have a sea border. You know, what can we do? And it did make me just realize, just if you're sitting in Kashmir anyway, how nuclearized it all looks. Is anything changing on that? I mean, the Indian nuclear force grows year by year, presumably, as does the Pakistani one. They're trying to get equal to China. What's the strategy?
I don't think they're trying to get equal to China. I think they want, I guess it grows and it becomes a little bit more sophisticated. But I think India also quite values the fact that it's been able to re-establish defense cooperation and indeed receiving defense and military supplies, including high-tech supplies from the United States, in spite of India's nuclear tests and its going public as a nuclear power. And I don't think Delhi wants to jeopardize that. So I think it will go fairly carefully and it won't shout a lot about it. And certainly, you know, Kashmir is a cauldron, and I've spent quite a bit of time in Kashmir and made many, many trips there. To be clear, nuclear weapons have not been deployed in the Kashmiri theatre by either side. Is it possible they could be? It's not impossible, but I think it's unlikely, because at the moment, the status quo is to India's favour. So all the Kashmir Valley, which is the centre of the dispute, the core of the dispute, is with India. Pakistan claims it. I cannot see Pakistan using nuclear weapons to win, to gain the Kashmir Valley. And indeed, I think Pakistan would simply be prepared to acknowledge the status quo, which is that Kashmir, the broader Kashmir, the political geography of Kashmir is complicated, remains partitioned between the two, which means India keeps the Kashmir Valley and Pakistan keeps what you might call the trimmings of the former princely state of Kashmir. India quite wouldn't live with that, though I think perhaps one day it will. But I think for Pakistan, that would be quite a good option, quite a good outcome. And it could be achieved eventually, I think, without the use of force.
So one final thought, and this is a sort of ludicrously journalistic question, I suppose, but we've got Modi in for his third term. How old is he? What does it mean about the fourth term? Is he, I mean, you just made the point at the beginning, he's on a downward trajectory, which is a new thing for him, and who knows whether he bounces back from that. But what are people thinking? What are his ambitions? What's his age? What's his health? What are his prospects?
He's 73. His health seems to be quite good, and we don't have any reason to believe otherwise. There has been a lot of speculation about succession. There is no clear succession strategy. And there are three people mentioned as possible succeeders to the Modi crown from within the BJP. One is a guy called Amit Shah, who's the Home Minister, a bit younger, very politically savvy, quite a bully. Another is Yogi Adityanath, who is actually a Hindu cleric who is the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh. But that's the state where they've just suffered quite a sharp reverse. So you really wonder whether that's going to happen. And there's a third one who is a bit of a compromise candidate. We don't have a clear succession within the BJP. My guess is that at the moment, Modi sees no reason why he should be thinking of standing down. To be honest, there's nothing else in his life. He's not going to be spending more time with his family. He doesn't have a family. Quite literally, he doesn't have a family. I do wonder, and of course, 73, by some standards, addressing an audience largely in the States, is not that old. But my guess is, I'd be surprised actually if he is the prime ministerial candidate for the BJP in 5 years' time. That's just my hunch.
Oh, really? Well, it's just that's thought. Very interesting. You say, no family, and he's got nothing else. I mean, one of the stories I heard about him when I covered his first election for the BBC, his first win, was that he always dines alone. And I thought it's an extraordinary sort of fact about someone that he prefers eat on his own. I mean, he was chief minister at that time. He could have had a lot of company if he wanted it. But he's I don't know, he's a solitary man.
He is a solitary guy. And I mean, I have to say he gives this, there is a narrative there, which I'm not sure is absolutely the truth. The narrative is that he's devoted, absolutely single-minded to the public role that he has taken on, to governing his state, now governing the nation. He doesn't allow anything to distract him. He often talks in his rallies about how he works 14 hours a day for you, for the people of India and for the nation. Is that absolutely strictly the case? I'm not sure, but he does live a very simple life. He's abstemious. He eats very simply. I don't think he drinks. He doesn't. I mean, lots of Bollywood movie stars are among his supporters, but he doesn't give the impression that he watches Bollywood movies very often or anything like that. He is single-minded. He is still a pracharak, an evangelist, a disciplined worker for the cause that he turned to as a teenager, and that's very much his own perception. And when he talks about being given a God-given duty, I mean, maybe a bit over the top, but I don't think that's simply rhetoric. I think that's how he sees his public purpose.
Well, look, thank you very much indeed. You've given us a lot of interesting things to think about in relation to Modi with all your years of experience there. Gives you a sort of commanding view of it all. So thank you all very much. I should just say to those online now that Political Tours have a number of things coming up. The ones I know about in particular are the US elections, which sound very interesting. Obviously, an amazing election, and they are organising a number of tours in relation to that. So I think places are still available on one of them. So that may be worth looking at if you're interested. But for now, Andrew Whitehead, thank you very much for joining us. And from all of us here on Political Tours, thank you very much and goodbye.